For example, two films from the 1950s and 1970s, which you probably all know the one on the right, and the one on the left should be familiar to you if you have a good, solid film education, where this is Forbidden Planet, where basically Walter Pidgeon is looking at Anne Francis, who is floating in midair. And if you notice, George Lucas not only stole the idea, he actually stole the literal shot from the film from 20 years earlier. That was back when Lucas was actually stealing good ideas. One thing that is important about this is that it suggests that people were already thinking about this notion of, where do I want to look? I want things to show up where I'm looking. There's an implication here that we're designing technology for monitoring where people are looking and doing things about it. And of course, obviously the holodeck. I mean, the most impressive thing to me about this actually is the hair, which I think that was a revolution all on its own. And this is actually very important in user interface design. Sun Microsystems commissioned this. Actually, I think they started it in 1992, but it got widespread visibility in 1994. They basically created a vision of what the user interface would look like in just the last few years, the middle of this last decade. And so and I think some of the ideas are now coming true. The basic idea of having giant, high-resolution wraparound screens and seamless video teleconferencing with multiple people, and being able to use your hands to directly type or gesture in the air. We're just now getting to the point where you can actually do this. Almost 2 decades after they started the project. But one of the things that's very clear from looking at this video is that this interface knows where you're looking and is making use of that, not just the other people, but the computer itself. And this notion of really being very user-centric and trying to fold the entire physical world electronically so that I could just have very intimate conversations with people with cyber objects between us was a large part of the University of North Carolina project that went on for a number of years. The Office of the Future. So there are a lot of people who've looked very seriously at what will the future look like when the computers are watching us watching the computers. And so I come to eye tracking with this background of years of people thinking these questions in the fields of graphics and user interfaces. Now, of course, eye tracking has gotten less clunky as the computers have gotten smaller, faster, cheaper. Moore's Law has actually been wonderful, and it's not just the computer's chips, it's also the CCD chips, but the fact that you can have small portable cameras and that you can do much, much more processing on the results has gradually, as some of the previous speakers said, been freeing things up. So this is, for example, what we until recently thought you needed to have. You needed to have something locked to the person's face one way or another. You saw some of the other speakers also showed that you had to, rest your jaw onto a chin rest because then everything is locked to your skull. But what you'd really like is to get beyond this and to gradually get more portable, and people have gradually been pushing for portability and something that you can walk around and wear. And so notice that the difference between this and the previous thing is that you have much more freedom to walk around in the world. This, of course, is Stanley Kubrick's vision. Some of you might recognize this. That's Malcolm McDowell. Back when he was, I guess, was he playing a good guy? Sure, okay. Before he was always playing bad guys. Sometimes people get it wrong. This is one of my favorite pictures of like ideas for the future that will never happen. But this is actually a picture that we just took yesterday. The same session that Bruce was talking about, where he got that data. Where I'm basically looking over the shoulder of, on the left is a subject, a grad student in this case who's demonstrating the system, and on the right is the person. You can see on the screen on the right, he is monitoring the software and seeing the setup and the instructions, et cetera. And then she's basically playing that same physics law game. Here's a close-up of it. And what's interesting about this is that the entire use, this is an eye tracker that, unfortunately, this costs $17,000, which means that you don't have them everywhere you want them. Yet. As long as something still costs $17,000, you have to think twice before you, say, put it on the desk of every learner. But notice, by the way, one cool thing about video is that what you actually can't see if you look at this thing is the fact that it's got this sort of infrared light. But we actually can see in the infrared when we start using our cameras to see for us. So what's really going on is the sort of flickering infrared that's giving you the glints off the eyes that enables the camera to figure out what's going on. But I think that one thing that's really important here, if you're thinking of potential applications of eye tracking, is the question of, there are things that eye tracking is really good for, and then there are things you would think it's good for, but maybe you have to be very careful. So for example, all of our uses in the Games for Learning Institute and everything that Bruce talked about is watching what people are doing. You're not using the eye tracking technology to make something happen. You're watching somebody use, say, their mouse or their cursor to do something. And people have tried making command interfaces. Obviously, as you probably realize, the military has been very interested in this because you want hands-free interfaces, because pilots in real-time situations are working on many, many other things, and there's many mission-critical moments, and the same thing is true when you have other kinds of experts like doctors, et cetera. But there's a problem because as I think you've realized now from the previous speakers, a lot of what we do with our saccades happens below our level of conscious attention. You don't want to, for example, say, oh, okay, let's click on the erase command, and then you start looking, and things start disappearing whenever you look at them. Like, oh, that erased, and that erased, and that erased, and like, thank God that didn't erase. Oh, too late. So there are some really difficult issues to deal with here. I call it the oops factor. But what I'd like to do now is talk about what people really do use this stuff for now, and then use that as a launching point to where it might get if Moore's law continues. I think you saw in a slide from a previous speaker that the same basic technology went from filling a room to just being a notebook computer. That will continue. These things will get smaller and smaller and lighter and cheaper, just as computers have gone from mainframes to laptops to your iPhone, or the Google Nexus 1 is vastly more powerful than even notebook computers were not that many years ago. So computers are gradually withdrawing into us. And then what are we going to do about that when we start thinking about the significance of eye tracking? So obviously when people look at something, they follow these different saccades, and what has turned out to be really useful is to take the statistical cloud of all the things people do and basically make these heat maps. So when you look over time, this is a number of users looking over time at the same scene, and clearly they, as you already know by now, they'll focus on things like the eyes and the mouth and anything that gives a hint as to the emotional expressiveness of what's going on underneath this. And this same technique has been applied over and over, and in each application domain, what you learn has a different significance. This is a visualization of Google search. And the results of Google search. And it starts showing there's something like, say, people want, which is basically you want to design things to promote what's called the F pattern, which is you want people scanning over a top line, maybe one or two, and then going down. And if their eyes are moving in shapes like this, that means you've designed your page in a way that they're going to find the results they need very quickly. If they start being all over the place, it means you failed because they're searching and they have no strategy. What's interesting is as you apply these concepts of, let's just look at the heat maps from lots of people, lots of users looking at web pages, et cetera, to different kinds of web pages, and you sometimes get some really surprising results. This is a really cool one. Nobody saw the ad. Big, bright, right in the middle, huge. Somebody spent a lot of money for it. And this is why actually Google has figured out that the text ads are actually the best stealth way to sell you something, because you won't know to not look at the text ad. Here, your large peripheral attention is saying, it's like, there were a number of years when I didn't actually even know that there were ad inserts in my New York Times. And then when somebody mentioned them, I said, oh yeah, they're ad inserts in my New York Times. I never saw them. So you actually can use eye tracking to figure out what it is that are essentially model-based blindness. We already know not to look at things, so we don't look at them. Here's a really interesting one. Somebody was trying to figure out what's the best way to position the model and the product. And in one case, she looks right at you. In another case, she looks at the product. And if you start looking at the heat maps of these things, it turns out that if she looks at you, you kind of only care about the model and the tagline. But if she looks at the product, she is giving you the message to look at the product. And this is something you might not ever even realize unless you had the eye tracking. People may not consciously realize where they're looking, but we can tell. One of the things that's really interesting in the field of computer graphics, a lot of things start out in the military, and then people start repurposing them. The interocular galvanometer, which is looking at the dipole of the eye, started out in this very rarefied setting, but in fact now it's become a mainstay of directors like Robert Zemeckis, who when he did his Beowulf film, and that's Angelina Jolie not looking very happy, and this is the outfit that she wore. They put lots of dots on her face, but the most important things to notice are the little patches that they have right there and right there. Did anybody see Beowulf? Okay, it was animated. Well, actually, it was motion performance captured. They had live actors. How many people? I'm just curious. How many people saw Avatar? Okay, so same basic idea, except better movie. But the basic idea here is that rather than having to figure out where their sight lines are, the actors are all acting on a set. And when they look at each other, we're using these techniques to figure out the direction. Oops, what just happened? It went dead. That's weird. That's not good. Same thing that happened to Bruce. Maybe this is haunted. Yeah. Hold on. Okay, it's back. Okay. There's also other uses. For example, my dad has been suffering from a particularly nasty form of degenerative variant of Parkinson's disease, and he's gradually getting locked into his body. His mind is absolutely wonderful as always, but he can't move anymore. So we've been looking at various assistive technologies, and one of the things that I've learned is I've become very, very familiar with the keyboard on the bottom there. The keyboard on the bottom basically looks vaguely like the QWERTY keyboard you're used to. It's got all the letters. However, they're in an arrangement where you can use very, very simple controls to move around and say, I want to type the next thing. So you would use, for example, eye tracking to sort of make commands about moving on the keyboard and then saying, type the character, type the character. And I actually think that there is a situation where eye tracking is actually really well suited, because very often when people suffer from different kinds of nerve degeneration, the nerves that connect our brain to our eyes are functioning generally much better than, say, your hand, which you can't move anymore. But I want to we only have a limited amount of time, and I wanted to kind of throw things out there so that you can then ask me cool questions afterward. So what's going to happen in the future? By the way, John Anderton, the character played by Tom Cruise in the film Spielberg film Minority Report, you can tell that there's eye tracking at work in a particular place in the film. Can anyone tell me where that was?
Yes. He was
walking through the mall. And it knows where he's looking. That's right. It knows exactly where he's looking, and it's targeting ads to him. So that's sort of the nightmare version of American consumerism run amok. And we can make that happen. But what's going to happen 15 years from now? I'd like to use an analogy, and I'm just going to end the talk with this. So if you think back on what corrective lenses looked like in 1970, this is what if you were nearsighted or something, you bought something like this, maybe some variation. If you were John Lennon, they were round, but it kind of looked like this. By the way, did you notice from the first video that a lot of people in this world have frameless glasses? Do you notice all the frame? I don't know why. We can talk about that when you ask questions. By 1985, this started replacing the other thing for many people. It's not that people didn't, oops, same thing. That is so weird. That never happens to this computer. Okay. So it's not that you don't have glasses anymore, but now you have the option. And in fact, some people actually have moved all the way to this. In my family, we suffer from cataracts. And so I now have, and as my mother does, as my brother does, have 2 completely plastic lenses inside my eye. And of course, when I had the operation done by this really great guy, the first question I asked him was, I'm going to do it for you anyway. I said, can I get Google? And he said, not yet. But the fact is, it's becoming more and more normal, and things that would have seemed outrageous at some point, pacemakers, have now become normal. And I think what happens, things that people will need, say someone is going through incipient, they're going deaf or they're going blind, and so we put some sort of implant. At some point, the technology gets cheaper and better, and people start doing it voluntarily. So I actually think that even though this is what a portable eye tracker looks like, you can have portable eye trackers now. I mean, this is basically the sort of as good as it gets. You just put this thing on, and it looks almost like glasses. I actually think that in the year 2025, it's going to start looking like this. We're going to be able to have these technologies in us. Maybe not 2025, maybe 2035, but at some point it's going to be so cheap and so simple that it's going to be like corrective lenses or many of the other things we don't take for granted. So the thing I want to close with is I was very influenced by some research that was done at IBM Research in, I believe it was the early 90s, where I'll describe to you very quickly. There was a setup where they'd ask people questions, and they used one of these fixed eye trackers that they had in the early 90s. It was one of the few places that could actually do extensive studies with eye tracking, because IBM had a lot of money. And they'd ask people a question that had either a yes or no answer, and they would ask them, and they'd say, look here if it's this, look here if it's that. And then they would use this high-speed eye tracking to see where their eyes were moving, and then they would indicate, they'd flash, they'd highlight the thing that they had chosen with their eyes. And what the subjective experience was of the test subjects was the computer was reading their mind and knew what they were going to pick. Because there was the quarter or third of a second delay of the conscious mind of this decision I'm making, but their eyes were already moving, the saccade was already happening. So what was interesting here is before they even knew they'd made a decision, their eye tracking was indicating to the computer what decision they'd made, and so they had this amazing experience of it knows what I'm going to do. And the reason that I think that that's important is that whenever it's going to happen, we all have eye tracking, which eventually we'll find it useful, just as we'll end up, it's another talk, but we'll end up having the screens inside of our eyes eventually. Maybe not in the next 10 years, but certainly in the next 25 years. It will matter because we will start designing fundamentally different user interfaces that know what your intentions are and in real time start giving you information that something really clunky like a mouse, you can't get that information from. So I think the real societal revolution that's going to come from eye tracking is going to come in the future when we can track all of our eyes all the time, and then the problems won't be technological, they're going to be legal, they're going to be ethical, they're going to be societal, and there are going to be a lot of stuff to talk about. So that's where I'd like to end.
Yesterday's New York Times referred to the gloved hand that supplants moving a mouse. I think this is something we all have to be looking forward to because we're all tired of moving a mouse. So we're looking forward to that kind of computer user interface. But there is that scene you mentioned in which the character Anderton is walking through a mall and he walks into a Gap, I think, and there he is greeted with, "Hello, Mr. Anderton. Last week you bought a t-shirt, size medium. would you like to buy another in another color? Now, that's startling, of course, and you wouldn't necessarily...
Especially if you're on the run from the law.
Right, which he was at that moment. Now, you wouldn't necessarily know that it was his eyes that were being read at that moment. It could have been an implanted chip or something else.
They had this little glint thing that they did.
Okay, thank you for reminding me of that, because that made it clear. Because the eye is also used for identification throughout the film, in other instances too. But to think that it's being used by advertisers is, of course, startling. So I think that's a film that might be a touchstone film for other...
and it comes up in real life. And don't worry, only Google will ever see your data. You know, this is a question we deal with now.
Right. So thank you for addressing those near-term fundamental changes, or perhaps you'd like to expand on that, what the fundamental changes will be for society.
Well, I mean, I'd actually like to point out, I mean, one thing to be fair about Minority Report, and I have a number of friends who worked on, they were design consultants for the film, and what they universally said was that Steven Spielberg flew everybody out, got them, you know, people like Jaron Lanier, you know, he'd put them in a room and he'd say, throw out ideas of what the future's going to look like, and the ideas he took were not the ones that could work, they were the ones that would make the coolest shot.
Interesting.
So Minority Report is really all about what would be the coolest looking future. So I wouldn't look at it too much as a cautionary tale, but I think it raises questions because everybody's seen it.
Interesting, when you mentioned the F pattern that's desired by advertisers on a website, that means no one's reading the right-hand side?
Right, that's right.
Well, that's going to be a disappointment to advertisers who are buying up that real estate on websites.
If they know it.
If any one of them were to read that data. Looking at websites and analyzing them through eye tracking is clearly of great interest. Could you talk a little more about scanning supermarket shelves or other ways, even looking at the back of a cereal box, ways in which marketers are using eye tracking?
I do know that, I mean, maybe this is just me, because I talked about the New York Times insert, but I started using Google in 1999. Somewhere around 2003, somebody told me that there were ads on the right side. And I said, no, there aren't. And then I went and looked at my computer. Oh my God, there are ads on the right side. And am I the only person, it took me forever to notice that there were ads? So there's something funny going on here. I mean, and that means that of course I never clicked on them, because I didn't even know they were there.
Is there an age or gender breakdown there?
Don't know.
Okay.
I just found out about the I am lucky button.
Oh, right.
I'm using Google for genders too.
Anyway, I'm sorry, I was asking about marketers and ways they're using eye tracking in situations where you're meant to scan an environment,
well, I do think that
supermarket.
The thing that you saw that we're using at the Create Lab at NYU, that we're using for our Games for Learning, is, okay, it costs $17,000. However, you're not wearing anything. And so one of the things that Moore's Law is going to enable, for good or bad, is they will be able to put some cheaper version of that thing in the store. And they can't do it now because it's not economically viable to do it now, but in 5 years, it's going to be affordable, and then we all have to deal with, do I want them doing that? And it's not a technological issue anymore.
And it'll be an ethical issue, because the question is whether or not we'll have any ability to say, I prefer not to be included.
Right, and you know what often happens is if there's money in it and people are lobbying, like, you don't want to wreck our economy, do you? Then things kind of just happen. You know? So we all might want to be aware of it.
You mentioned that your father has some diminished capability.
Physically, yeah.
I know that eye tracking is used for those with locked-in syndrome and also in research on autism, because the question is, in one case, what are the autistic in that whole spectrum looking at that perhaps the rest of us are not? And for those with locked-in syndrome or other diminished capability, whether or not they can be further enabled by being able to control things with their eyes, their eye movements. So,
what's the question?
Well, there isn't a question there, except to say that it's being used both ways. Then that's sort of that's sort of turning it around to enable people and also to pull from people information.
Yeah, my dad, you know, he writes books and he knows exactly what he wants to say. It's just become almost impossible for him to say it now. he doesn't have the muscle control. And I think we've tried some things using pressure pads, because we also at our lab developed some really nice multi-touch pressure technology. But I think the thing about the eyes is he doesn't like it, because it takes over your visual field. You can't be looking at things while you're doing this kind of make-believe typing thing, so it's not pleasant. But it's sort of the last refuge he has, where he has a fairly, a solidly functioning subsystem of brain to body. So, and if you're in a situation like that, whatever works is our attitude. We're all trying everything, but whatever works. Because his quality of life at this point is about how much he can express himself.
Yes, and I can imagine that therefore you're happy that you've had this area of interest and expertise, and also that you come to this point in its development that it can perhaps be of help to him in the very, very near future. I think we'll take a couple questions if people will go to the microphone, and while people are going to the microphone, I'll tell you that I think that there are rimless glasses because eyeglasses manufacturers simply needed to sell a new brand, a new model.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
So again,
Ken, I'd like to hear what you have to say. I haven't heard anyone talk about this, but the idea that the computer can read my mind because your eyes are indicating things before you're even aware of them. How does this play into
the illusion
indications of criminal intent or, let's say, terrorist activity? Has eye tracking been used in interrogations, for instance, or could it be a screening system at airports?
Wow, yet another thing. Full retinal scan. I do not know. I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I don't have any knowledge about that. I literally don't know. I think probably we could. I mean, I think it's a really good point, but I don't know that there's any question there that I know that I could answer fruitfully.
Okay, just
it's good to raise, though.
Shifty eyes. Bringing this back to art a little bit, which is not necessarily where you want to go, but in 1967, there was this really interesting anti-Gestalt book written by Anton Ehrenschrei called The Hidden Order of Art. And this goes back to your question about the foveal and how much our technologies depend on the pre-conscious or proto-conscious or just about conscious targeting of vision. And, there's a huge history of modernity in which that has become a kind of obsession. But Ehrenzweig argued that creativity itself comes from outside that. Quite specifically, quite logically, where the conscious mind was going was not where the source of the artist's creative information was. So I don't know what to do with this except to kind of paintball you. I mean, I feel a little bit like
go ahead. Yeah.
The research is pinned to the Kandinsky show as if he was coming from there. But in a curious way, I think he was coming, at least as Ehrenzweig would put it, who comes out of a similar, Eastern and Central European culture of sort of questioning the Descartes model.
Sure.
Ehrenzweig is sort of saying, no, get the head out of a vice because that is not where humanity is productive. So I just throw that out for.
Well, I'm going to treat it as a question and answer it.
Go.
Okay. When I was watching the eye tracking experiments in the video earlier this morning of the various subjects, all of them, looking at the Kandinsky painting, what I saw, which I think affirms what your hypothesis you're introducing says, is that it seems that from that affirms a theory that just came to me while I was watching this, that what Kandinsky is engaged in is a sort of deliberate visual aphasia. He is saying, I am going to give you things that will vaguely remind you and trigger on a subconscious level the same things that you associate with centers of interest, objects, figures, but I'm not going to do it in any way that you're going to be able to just say, okay, this is it. So you're going to keep your eyes moving because I'm never going to answer those questions for you. I'm just going to be triggering things in your own mind. And I think that this is a characteristic of 20th century art more than earlier art movements, is that even on the level of the paint on the canvas and fundamental representation, it wasn't just a pointer out to something out there, but it forces us to look inward. It's not a coincidence, I think, that the Freudian movements were happening at the same time, that we ourselves are as an observer in the system, can't remove ourselves from it. So I completely agree, because that's what I saw from what the eye tracking data was saying.
And I want to remind you that at the end, at noon approximately, when we've concluded with our last speakers that follow this panel, we'll see the entirety of Graham Weinbrand's 30-minute film. And the first of the 3 sections is an actor giving voice to words that Kandinsky wrote about what he thought he was doing in creating a painting. It's very, very significant. I'm afraid we may not have time for this last questioner. If you would please hold your question until afterwards when you can speak to Ken Perlin.
It's really interesting, though.
Sorry?
It's really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's a really quick question.
Okay, real quick then, real quick.
It's pertinent, actually. First of all, thank you for a great presentation. Secondly, the question is, you refer to the F rule, and you showed a few things, and it's used in research and whatnot. Has there been any research done with other languages? Because it goes left to right, and English is read left to right. Like there's Asian languages that are read right to left. How about that? Would the F be flipped?
I don't know. I think we'd have to go to Israel and then see what Google looks like there. It's a really good question. I don't know.
And in terms of, is that also incorporated with the right and left brain?
Yeah, I don't know. These are really good questions. I can't answer them, but they're great to raise.
I'm afraid yes and no. Yes and no. Thank you for that answer. Anyway, thank you. Thanks, Ken.